Hi. Thanks again to the editors of the Case Western Law Review and the faculty here for being great hosts. You guys have done a great job, and it's great to be here for this timely event. I have to confess that when I accepted the offer to participate in this symposium about 6 months ago, I thought I would have a paper, actually. It would be great to kind of play out the paper before you guys and get thoughts. I don't have a paper. I didn't realize that 2 months later I'd become associate dean of faculty at Emory Law School, kind of against my will. And as those of you who are on law faculty know, the associate deans of faculty at least spend their time mostly, predominantly, almost all my time, dealing with other things than my own research. And in fact, I've spent literally no time on that paper that I was planning on presenting. Yeah, literally no time. So, so instead, I've got some kind of rough observations about the redistricting process this cycle in Georgia and California. And so this is to some degree off the cuff, but they're related to things that I've been thinking about. First, in Georgia, about what Ashcroft means, looking back with the perspective of another redistricting cycle. And then in California, the debate about communities of interest and the way that redistricting has been going on there with the Citizens Commission that's making the decisions in California. Okay, so first Georgia. So those of us that think a lot about voting rights, we all remember the arguments of African American leaders in Georgia and Ashcroft that represented a kind of shift from the traditional positions of African American leadership on the VRA, certainly from the 1990s. And they argued that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act should permit what was really a Democratic gerrymander in Georgia, unpacking African American voters from supermajority minority districts to spread out Democratic strength and increase the chances that Democrats would hold the legislature. And they wanted essentially to trade off descriptive representation, which had been the focus of the VRA, for greater Democratic success, essentially. And what this recognized was the idea that African American prospects were more closely aligned with the number of Democrats elected rather than necessarily the number of African American elected officials who won office. So out of Ashcroft, you had emerging a kind of modern conception of racial politics that's rooted in some pretty major sociopolitical changes that had occurred since 1965, right, since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Now flash forward to today, and there's a kind of symmetry or continuation of a lot of the arguments that Democrats and African American leaders are taking today in opposition to a Republican gerrymander, now that Republicans have taken over pretty much everything in the state of Georgia. This cycle, the current Republican plan, according to projections I've seen, it looks like 49 of the 57 seats that Democrats are projected to win are going to be African American elected officials elected out of those seats. So this is essentially making the Democratic Party African American. There's very few white Democrats that we expect to be elected, with, of course, the Republicans commanding both houses of the legislature. And the Democrats here are again arguing that there should be fewer majority-minority districts, fewer African American leaders elected to the state legislature. And it's in fact these African American leaders, for instance, Stacey Abrams, an African American woman, a Democratic House leader, who are making these arguments. So there's a kind of continuation of what we saw in Ashcroft and the position that African Americans and Democrats are taking here. There's a bit of an added twist, because here the Democrats now are arguing that the Republicans are purposely pairing white Democrats, white incumbent Democrats, and African American Democratic candidates in an effort to essentially purge the Democratic Party of white Democrats and make the Democratic Party in Georgia the black party and marginalize them in a way that sort of goes beyond simple gerrymandering. But putting that added twist aside, you see a lot of connections between the positions taken last cycle and this cycle. But there's been a major change, and that is now Republicans control the state. They control the redistricting process. So I think out of that, we can see two lessons when we think about looking back on Ashcroft with the perspective of this cycle. And I think what they tell us is that Ashcroft was more interesting as a political matter than a legal one. Okay, so on the one hand, the current redistricting cycle in Georgia shows the rightness, basically, of those who argued that Ashcroft represented this critical shift in the way that Democrats and African American fortunes were linked, and how it didn't make sense to focus too narrowly on descriptive representation in modern America anymore. Okay? And in fact, that linkage of racial and party fortunes has continued forward and lasted whether we have Democratic or Republican control. So we see the same thing going on now with Republicans in charge. It's not obvious that African American perceptions of self-interest would be essentially identical now that we have really Republican control and no foreseeable prospect of the Democrats taking back really any significant office in the state. I think that's pretty much unanimous view of people in Georgia. So that's one thing. So politically, we see the triumph of the kind of political conception of racial politics that we saw in Ashcroft. But on the other hand, I think the current cycle shows essentially how little was at stake legally in Ashcroft, and here's what I mean. So in Ashcroft, there was a Democratic gerrymander last cycle, and you had very particular facts. So you had Democratic control in a state that was very clearly swinging away from Democrats. It was gonna go Republican eventually. And it was such that you needed very, very aggressive gerrymandering and aggressive trading off of descriptive representation to keep Democratic control if there was to be any hope. So in that case, greater discretion to the state, essentially to the Democrats, was clearly more beneficial for African American interests, for Democratic interests. And trying to think along those lines, if you talk to some Democratic lawyers in the state of Georgia, what they say is, well, if only Ashcroft hadn't been overridden by Congress, we would be in better shape now, right? If only Ashcroft had stayed good law, we'd be in better shape now, we wouldn't be getting hammered. It's actually, I think, hard to see why that would be the case. So it's hard to see why Ashcroft, even assuming if it wasn't overridden by Congress, how it would help African Americans or the Democratic Party now. Because I think Ashcroft was mostly about discretion to the state through the Section 5 process and how to sort of conceive African Americans' political interests. And in this case now, with Republican control, it would simply give greater discretion to the Republicans in deciding how to gerrymander African Americans and Democrats, if it meant anything at all. Okay? And so today, it's not clear that Democrats would prefer that the Republican government have greater discretion. It's certainly not clear that the Republican government would prioritize greater Democratic strength over more descriptive representation. That seems unlikely. And certainly nothing in Ashcroft would have required the Republicans to do so, to spread out African American voters, trade off descriptive representation for greater partisan representation. That really doesn't make that much sense to me. Now, there is a sense in which this is about the rhetoric of the debate, and that is, right now Republicans are saying the VRA requires us to draw majority-minority districts. That's what it's all about. And so we have no choice in drawing all these majority-minority districts, because that's the command. And the Democrats, I guess, could argue if Ashcroft had not been overridden, they could have said, no, you actually do have a choice. You could spread out African-American voters and give us more seats, give the Democrats more seats at the expense of descriptive representation. That would have been fine. So I guess there's that. But it doesn't seem like Ashcroft would have a lot of bite in making the Republicans do what Democrats would like here. And in fact, Section 5 is really the only thing that keeps the Republicans from gerrymandering the Democrats and African Americans even worse. I mean, it's really the only thing that's holding the Republicans back at all in the state. Whether you think that's good or bad, I think that's true. Now, there is this kind of intriguing claim that the Democrats seem intent on making, which is, well, right now, consistent with the kind of the twist that I mentioned earlier, the Republicans are targeting white incumbents and pairing them with African American elected leadership in an effort to kind of marginalize the Democratic Party as the black party. And perhaps that's kind of racial intent that might worry us in lots of ways. But it's certainly a kind of untraditional Section 5 kind of argument, at least as we've sort of thought about it more recently. So that's Ashcroft in Georgia. What about California and the Citizens Commission and communities of interest? So redistricting has generally been seen, or traditionally been seen, as a 14th Amendment problem. And the argument goes that the 14th Amendment ought to serve as some sort of check, some sort of prohibition on the government, and limit it in some sort of dilution sense. Basically, it's got to limit the degree to which the government can underrepresent certain politically salient groups. So it's been usually understood as a question of fair or unfair allocation of representation in what is almost always a kind of incumbent-dominated, politically self-interested process. And it's a negative framing, really, of redistricting, what the government can't do constitutionally. And what I find interesting about the redistricting process in California and the debate around it, and I guess commissions just generally, is that we have a real opportunity to think affirmatively about what we want from redistricting, right? Not what the government can't do, but what the government really should do. Political scientists have always thought along these lines, but I think election lawyers, we've thought a lot less about that. And we should think more about that. So the Citizens Commission, normally redistricting is done by the legislature, and it's really obvious what they're going to do. They're going to try to maximize all their political objectives, and so all you're trying to do is check that constitutionally as an election lawyer. The Citizens Commission, though, has essentially, with the guidance of certain kind of legal sources, a chance to do what they think is normatively the right thing. So the Citizens Commission is, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of like a citizens jury, right, that is going to actually draw the lines in California, that has drawn the lines in California. And so it's not obvious what they ought to do unless we have some kind of normative theory about what redistricting ought to do, how we ought to structure our districts. And what's emerged, I think, there may be some disagreement about this, but consistent with the representation focus of the 14th Amendment framing of redistricting that I mentioned, this discussion has tended to gravitate toward the fair allocation of group representation. So in California, this has meant a very big portion of the commission's deliberation and debate about what it's doing has centered on drawing districts around communities of interest. Okay, so figuring out what the salient groups are and drawing them districts that give them representation. And there's a forthcoming Harvard Law Review article that proposes creating homogeneous districts that have essentially as little internal diversity as possible, very consistent with the idea of communities of interest. And so I want to sound, I guess, a little note of caution about too great a focus on representation when we reframe redistricting in terms of affirmative principles, when we start to rethink the way election lawyers normally approach redistricting. And I'd argue that the 14th Amendment priors that we have and the framing that we've traditionally drawn upon aren't entirely helpful here beyond setting some outer bounds in some sort of dilution sense. And I'd argue that maybe the First Amendment might provide some affirmative guidance for redistricting here. Normally we think of the First Amendment more in terms of campaign finance and creating a healthy democratic structure. I think Sam mentioned that earlier in connection with the public financing case. But we might be able to bring some of that into redistricting, because what we are doing here is setting the parameters for electoral competition and representation. And Justice Kennedy, in fact, has kind of hinted at that this might be an approach that has some appeal to him in redistricting in the LULAC case. So what ideally do we want district lines to achieve as a normative matter? Well, one answer might be the allocation of safe representation for various groups. That's certainly one approach, and Tom has written really eloquently along those lines, and I have a lot of sympathy for that view, actually. But this type of homogeneity centered around communities of interest, generally as a theoretical matter, should be associated with less conflict and less of what I've called in other work democratic contestation. And so there is some work on political informational networks, and it suggests some sort of trade-off between homogeneity and deliberation. And the basic idea here is if you're around people who basically agree with you on most things, then you're going to agree and you're more likely to participate in politics. It's not really even about ideology necessarily. You're more likely to turn out. You're more likely to participate politically along lots of dimensions. But you may be a little bit less likely to think through your arguments because you're not really exposed to alternate viewpoints. If you're challenged a lot, you may deliberate a little bit more, but you may participate a little bit less. And so there might be a bit of a trade-off between participation and deliberation, between homogeneity and deliberation. And we might value deliberation at some level. Now, what this all means for districting is not perfectly clear. I don't pretend that it is. And as this kind of plays out empirically, what homogeneity or heterogeneity means at the district level, it's really hard to figure out. And the studies point in different directions. Homogeneity, heterogeneity correlate with lots of other things that are probably important in thinking about political behavior and thinking about deliberation, like media markets, geography, race. All of those things will be associated with competitiveness, turnout, other things we care about. So there's probably not a simple relationship between homogeneity, heterogeneity on the one hand, and other things we care about once we get serious about mentioning. It probably matters how we construct homogeneity. That matters a lot too. But I might warn us against pushing too quickly toward homogeneous districts centered on communities of interest. And what we might lose in doing so is ensuring that voters are exposed to challenging arguments and viewpoints, what Sam described earlier today in a phrase that I like, as the greater richness of political speech in the democratic experience, right? So that's one thing we might care about. It's a central part of democracy, and it might be important for us to consider in redistricting as well. Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have some time for questions and discussion. Let me ask first if any of our speakers want to respond to anything that anybody else has said. If not, then the mics are open, and let me encourage questions.
So I have a couple of loosely related questions. First, for John, I found this data about the disparities in voting power fascinating, and I want you to go beyond what your data say to speculate about what you think may be causing these disparities in voting power, why African Americans, people of low income, to some extent women, are getting less bang for their voting buck. Second, this relates to the discussions of Ohio and California. Boy, you know, if you were looking, I've been sort of to some extent involved in the debates over redistricting here. And if you were looking for a poster child for partisan gerrymandering, you'd be hard pressed to do better than Ohio both in the last cycle and this one. I mean, we're just, put it in the simplest terms, we're more or less a 50-50 state, and yet 3/4 of our congressional seats are likely to be Republican seats. I have a couple of former students of whom I'm very proud who are in the room today, and in the midst of these, Sarah Cherry, who's counsel to the Ohio House Democrats, and Representative Kathleen Clyde. So, you know, I'm part of a group right now that's actually working on drafting something that's partially modeled on California, that, you know, if there's enough money to gather signatures, we'd like to try to put on the ballot in 2012. That's a big if. And, you know, we're literally in the process of writing this thing right now. Basing it on the competition, partly on California, partly on the competition criteria that Mark, you alluded to, focusing on, you know, compactness, competitiveness, representational fairness, and maintenance of county municipal boundaries. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you know, kind of that, whether that kind of process modeled loosely on California makes sense here and in other states. I'm particularly interested in community interest as a factor and whether that's something that should be concluded. I gather from presentation that I heard from Karen McDonald, who was the staff person for the California Commission, that was a bit of a headache, but worthwhile in terms of, you know, getting public participation and getting people involved in the process and talking about what really is and isn't a community of interest.
I guess I'll go first. In terms of the origins of differential group voting power, I mean, I guess I sort of put my cards on the table about how I measured it. I guess I'm grateful for the opportunity to think about and talk about how, you know, what reforms might be introduced to equalize group voting power. I mean, if I measure group voting power based on turnout and sort of vote propensity and group size, some of those things are more amenable to governmental institutions than others, and for turnout, for the vote propensity between the parties, I think, you know, maybe nothing less than doing away with single-member districts would actually be necessary to actually make that happen. You'd have to move to a proportional system because the capture of the groups is really a function of the fact that we only have two parties. The fact that we have two parties is a function of the fact that we have a single-member district system. So,
I see. So the two-party system is the real underlying cause
for that segment of differential voting power, in my view, yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, any efforts either through governmental or private sector initiatives to increase turnout across all groups would also equalize group voting power more than it currently is. And group size is a harder one to imagine how that might change. Obviously, through districting, you can change the differential size of groups, but overall, in the country as a whole, you sort of have to work with the fact that some of these groups only make up 12 or 13% of the population. So, you know, in the end, why do the groups get differential sort of bang for their voting buck? It's because they have different voting power, I think. That's my argument, essentially.
I know, I guess I'm trying to get at
why?
The why question. I think you partly gave the answer, which is single-member districts.
Yes, that would be part of it. I mean, I think majority and minority districts might also play a role in this with respect to African Americans and Latinos, but I have to think through how that might be. But maybe the culprit is single-member districts. And as long as you have politicians who want to be reelected and they look at the voting population and those citizens contribute differentially to their ability to get reelected, then you can't get away from this.
Citizens commissions and communities of interest.
I'll talk about communities of interest real quick. And Justin has written as much or more on homogeneous districts than I have.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Nobody reads it, but
communities of interest is really slippery. I mean, I've got some great war stories. From Texas last time, I was on the stand, and one of the competing plans was he was trying to, you know, the lawyer was basically trying to tell the judge how great his communities of interest were through me, you know, saying, oh, look, we've made the districts in West Texas look like they did in the 1950s. And like, he thought this was a good idea. I'm like, why? You know, why? And so he thought that, you know, somehow mimicking districts from 50 years ago would be a good thing, and this was a community of interest. And largely, we think of communities of interest as geographic, and I think that's the huge mistake we always make, because communities of interest are ideological. And to the extent that ideology and geography overlap, well, then we could talk about geography, but they don't always, and they don't a lot. So, you know, is Dallas County a community of interest? Well, you know, when the federal government is sending us, you know, whatever, when it's distributive politics, that's when geographic communities are real communities. But on real important issues, ideological issues, they're not. And so that's why I think taking the line seriously is probably a mistake. So.
As far as citizens commissions in California, a couple of years ago, the California Journal of Politics and Policy asked me and another guy named Matt Jarvis to write some articles on redistricting in California and the question of whether or not instituting something like the Citizens Commission and trying to get more competitive districts would solve some of the issues that California has, because California has some really interesting governmental procedures, including some strange supermajority requirements in the state legislature. What was that?
It's a kind way of putting it.
Yes. And so Matt Jarvis and I wrote these dueling articles on whether or not redistricting reform would do anything. And Matt Jarvis took the position that we should have a redistricting system, something like the Citizens Commission, that would create more competitive districts with the hope that that would actually create bias. Now, this is an important recognition that a lot of people miss, which is that more competitive districts, you get less proportionate results in the end. But his objective was to create something that would create a Democratic supermajority to get over the supermajority requirements that make California politics a mess. I took the position that that probably wouldn't work. So then just recently, in the last couple of months, we have the new redistricting plan. So the Journal asked me and Matt Jarvis to revisit those articles. And essentially what happened was the California plan was produced by a Citizens Commission, but it actually looked like a Democratic scheme. It is a plan with a significant Democratic bias. But the interesting thing about it is, despite the fact that there is a bias there, it is a bias that is probably not big enough to create the Democratic supermajority necessary to deal with the legislative requirements. So the end result is a system in which you have disproportionate representation in the state legislature, but not sufficiently disproportionate representation to deal with legislative procedure, which in a sense is the worst of all worlds. And this is what a Citizens Commission produced. So when I wrote my second article for this, I started it in sort of a snarky way, saying, hooray, everything is solved. The great and glorious Citizens Commission has produced a plan, and a new golden era will begin. And then proceeded to say, no, that's not what's going to happen. So in essence, you have that Citizens Commission, which produced a plan which is arguably the worst of all possible worlds.
I take a different view of that, but I don't want to get into an argument with you.
So on competition versus communities of interest,
Yeah.
because we might think that
Yeah.
there's a tension between those two. So I think with the reform experience over the last 10 years, what that tells us is that it's easier to sell the communities of interest story than competition. And I think that has to do with just interest group politics. So I think the various kind of group leadership, and it's really elite mobilization that matters here. It's not the average guy on the street that's really outraged and becoming an activist. And so they can organize around that. They know that that type of approach is going to carve out, representation for them, and they can argue for that. And there's something appealing about that, about letting the process decide that, which groups really matter, and letting them fight that out, rather than designing that from afar with the sort of hope of objectivity. So to the degree that we think we're creating a neutral process and we have concerns about whether anything could be neutral, there's something nice about having it centered around this kind of interest group bargaining and a political process that occurs before these commissions, rather than by some sort of purportedly objective design. And competition's harder to sell, in part because it's scary to these groups. They have no guarantee in a process like that. And there's no one really fighting as effectively for the median voter, because that's really who wins out with the competition approaches at some level.
Yeah.
Other than Sam, right, who has, I guess he hasn't worked hard enough, really. And so the competition approaches haven't done as well, I think, politically, even if there's a lot of normative appeal to them.
Thank you.
If I could, as a geographer, I guess I want to take a little bit of exception to the idea that geography doesn't matter. I think, I think, communities of interest obviously do have a certain level of geography, and obviously there's an element of dispersion of communities of interest over geography, ubiquitous distributions, if you will, in some cases. But, geography does still matter in a lot of ways in terms of communities of interest. I guess one of the things I have a question about, because I'm not familiar with the literature, is whether or not anybody's actually studied whether or not in non-competitive districts there actually is less dialogue about from various points of view than in competitive districts. I mean, that's sort of an assumption. I hear a lot of talk about that, but I don't know if there's anything empirically valid about it, basically.
Thank you.
Hi there. I had a former Ohio State Senator who has been involved in redistricting repeatedly come to my election law class to discuss redistricting. And one of the points that he made about this year's proposed, before the redistricting plan that was in the paper yesterday, which is after the time he came, he said that he thought that the Republicans' plan was excellent. He's a Democrat. He said that he thought that it was fine, far better than the Democrats had any reason to expect. And the points that he made about it were, first of all, that instead of just one protected minority district, there were now two. Secondly, that incumbents were forced to face off in two different places, but one pair were Republicans and one pair were Democrats. And he said, on the whole, this is pretty good and pretty fair, and he thought that this was a better map than they had, as I said, any right to expect. So I'm wondering what you think about that. And then the other question, didn't seem like many of you addressed incumbent protection as far as different kinds of criteria, and that was one that was explicitly excluded from the California Citizens Commission. And there is a role for incumbency, of course, and particularly in political seniority. So I'm wondering, in your view, and against the other considerations for redistricting, would you want incumbent protection to be eliminated as one of the acceptable criteria?
Let me respond to your first question, Candace. I've done my own quick evaluation of how competitive the districts are according to the approved plan. And as I say, I came out with, I can't remember the numbers, 3 or something that were competitive. And that's not what you're hearing in the paper, in the media. The media talks about, what, there are 12 clearly Republican and 4 Democrat. Well, I don't know where they're drawing that line on what's Democrat, what's Republican. In terms of totals above and below 50%, that may be true, but there's that 45 to 55% vote swing in there that you would probably call competitive. And there are some competitive districts according to that 45-55% range. If you look at at least the 2008 and the 2010 election results. So that's the first question that you asked.
I'll say a couple words about that. As far as the Ohio plan, you can make the case that the Republicans could have tried to take more advantage than they did. Based on the analysis that I was presenting, I don't really think they could have gone much further without putting their own seats significantly at risk. But there was a perception that they could have done more. And I think the argument that the plan sort of looked fair came from a fear that Republicans might try to go further than they did. I don't think that's what's happening. I think what was happening was they realized that they made very big gains in 2010 because 2010 was a good year for Republicans, and they thought that a better strategy than trying to pick up even more than that was to try to consolidate the gains that they made, which I think was essentially what was happening. Now, if your expectation is that they're going to do even more than that, then you're going to be satisfied with an attempt to consolidate their gains. As for the incumbency protection issue, Tom and I are the two people who would argue that we like incumbency protection plans. We both want very homogeneous districts, not because we like protecting incumbents, but because we think that they are more representative plans overall, and the consequence of that is protecting incumbents, and we're both fine with that. But everybody else, I think, is pretty much going to say, don't protect incumbents.
Well, I think being aware of where incumbents live when you draw is different than protecting incumbents to the extent that you and I would protect them. So that was the Democratic Commission, as I understood it. They weren't supposed to know, where the incumbent. They're supposed to draw the map, because that's the first thing you do. It's like, where's Waldo? Where are the 40 Waldos on the map? Because that's who we're drawing for. And I think that they didn't do that. So that was the distinction. So, and I'm agnostic about that. I haven't really thought about drawing it without knowing where they're living. So.
I don't see a reason to have incumbency protection as one of the priorities in an affirmative redistricting process. I mean, I don't have a problem with incumbents being reelected, but they have advantages, and they're likely to have those advantages. They have them in non-districted offices as well as districted ones, and so I don't know that we need to build that into the system.
I'm not a law student, or in fact, I'm his GA. And so I like a lot of what you guys say kind of doesn't go over my head necessarily, but just when we were talking about this before, like I thought this was supposed to be about like one person, one vote thing, and this communities of interest thing is very interesting. But like I live in a heavily Democratic neighborhood on the west side of Cleveland, and I've voted for Democrats before. But I sometimes feel like if I wanted to vote for a Republican, well, what's the point of me going to vote? Because my vote doesn't matter. And so when people draw districts like that, like why don't they draw districts where I can actually listen to both sides, and I'm not going to just assume that the Democrat's going to win. So, you know, I can listen to both sides and actually make a choice. And do you think that people in general vote along party lines, and that people don't? I don't know this. You guys like when, like, and the law is good and everything, but it kind of seems that it complicates everything.
Yes, people do vote along party lines, and they do very little else. If you look empirically at voting behavior, you can explain something. You can explain somewhere between 80 and 90% of all votes with just party ID. So yes, people vote along party lines. As far as talking to people, so Mark and I happen to live very close to each other. We can talk to each other. If somebody were to draw a district line between us, I don't think that would stop us from talking to each other. So I'm not. Maybe it would, but I'm not sure why somebody.
Matters.
Okay, so if somebody were to split our neighborhood up, then legally I would no longer be allowed to talk to Mark, or he wouldn't want to talk to me because we'd be in competition with each other or something like that. You can talk to whoever you want. I'm not sure what drawing district lines will do. As far as political dialogue goes, the one argument you can make about district lines, and some people have, is that if you draw heterogeneous districts, you're more likely to have competitive elections, which Tom and I hate and everybody else loves. But one of the consequences of that is you have more active campaigns in those competitive districts. There is more attention to politics. This is measurable. People know more. However, you also wind up with election results that make people a lot less happy, which is the point that Tom and I both argue.
What you just said, though, go against what one of you said earlier, that if you have more competitive districts, people are less likely to participate in the political process. But you just said if there are more competitive districts, then people are more likely to participate.
Yes, and empirically, if you look at the data, places where there are competitive elections, you have higher turnout, you have more knowledge of the candidates, things like that. This is measurable, and people have been doing the analysis for a couple of years now. The results are fairly consistent on this.
So on the district line thing, so I take the point that the district line is not going to alter the likelihood that you guys talk, but where you draw the lines affects the election discourse potentially. So,
yes.
So what candidates enter, what they talk about, that is affected by the district lines, and I guess that's what I'm talking about, less about the one-to-one.
Yeah.
Is there data on that? Or is that just assumed?
I haven't seen any direct data, quantitative data, about the political dialogue itself and the quality of the dialogue, but what is measurable, we can measure things like turnout. Turnout is higher when districts are more competitive. I just don't care. No, just Tom. People know more about the candidates. Well, Tom and I don't care, but that's measurably true. As far as the quality of the political dialogue, I don't know how you would measure that, but it is plausible that you would have more meaningful political dialogue in those districts, whatever that means. And I'm not sure why Tom and I would care, but that might make a lot of people happy.
Well, I think his point about competitiveness was he just wanted to be the decisive voter, right? Right. No, we all do, right, as it turns out.
Well, the thing is your vote won't matter, though. The likelihood that you will be the pivotal voter in an election is so small that it is actually smaller than the likelihood that you will be hit by a bus and killed on the way to the polling place. So you don't matter.
It has to feel like that it's worthwhile to go to vote. Like whoever I'm voting for has a chance.
That chance is unrelated to whether or not you vote, but
You're a Democrat and you live in a Democratic district. It sounds like it's a good match.
I'm registered as a Republican and I live in a Democratic district.
But you vote for Democrats?
Yeah, I vote both ways now.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, well, on that note, maybe we should we should call it call time on this session. I think we've had a lot of really good ideas. We will take a short break, reconvene just after 2:30. But meanwhile, thank you very much for a really stimulating program.